Hardy Merriman is a senior advisor to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. He has presented widely to activists, academics, members of non-governmental organizations, and others on a variety of topics related to strategic nonviolent conflict. He was Director of Programs and Research at ICNC from 2005 to 2007. Prior to this, Mr. Merriman worked for 3 years at the Albert Einstein Institution and contributed to and edited the book Waging Nonviolent Struggle, 20th Century Practice and 21st Century Potential by Gene Sharp. More recently, Mr. Merriman has published chapters about the role of nonviolent action in reducing terrorism and about the dynamics of nonviolent action as a technique of political struggle. He also co-authored A Guide to Effective Nonviolent Struggle, a training curriculum for activists. At this point, I'll hand it over to Hardy Merriman.
Great, thank you. Thank you also to ICNC for asking me to present. And I want to say to everyone who's signed into this webinar, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, depending on where you are in the world. It's really amazing to me that we can all share this hour, even though we're all, some of us, thousands of miles apart. And I really want to thank all of you for signing in. The topic of this webinar is costs and risks in nonviolent conflict. And there is a lot of material to cover in just 30 to 40 minutes. So I will attempt to speak clearly, but also speak somewhat quickly at times in order to get through all of this material. But I do encourage your questions during the Q&A after I'm done speaking. And I encourage you to write me email if you have any questions that we're not able to get to by the end of this hour. So I'd like to start my presentations simply. So let's start with definitions. Nonviolent conflict. Nonviolent conflict, very simply, this is a colloquial definition, is a conflict in which at least one party uses nonviolent action as its means or primary means to wage the conflict. So in this webinar, I'm referring to cost and risk in conflicts in which at least one side has chosen primarily nonviolent action as a means to wage its struggle. This leads to the question, what is nonviolent action? Nonviolent action, which is also called civil resistance sometimes, different people have different terminology for this. Sometimes it's called people power, some people call it political defiance. Regardless of which term you use, I'm going to sort of merge them into one definition right now. And this definition is, I'm drawing from Gene Sharp. And Gene Sharp, for those of you who may not know, is one of the main theoreticians, one of the main thinkers in this field of nonviolent action or civil resistance. And Sharp defines nonviolent action as the technique of waging conflict without the use of violence, and it consists of 3 kinds of acts. The first kind of act is acts of commission. This means that people who are engaging in nonviolent resistance may do things that they're not supposed to do or not expected to do or are forbidden by law from doing. So, for example, nonviolent resistors may rally, they may hold a march, they may choose to defy certain laws through civil disobedience. They may violate censorship and speak out. They may set up alternative institutions such as schools, for example, or alternative organizing institutions, labor unions. So that's one kind of action that nonviolent action involves. The other kind of action that it can involve is acts of omission. This is when groups do not do things that they're supposed to do, expected to do, or required by law to do. So, for example, a movement may refuse to pay their rent. People may refuse to pay taxes. A movement may choose to boycott a certain product. They may choose not to work in a strike, or they may choose to work slowly. They may choose not to attend school or various government programs. These are all acts of omission, people choosing to not do things that they're expected or required to do. And then the third kind of action is simply a combination of acts of omission and commission. So, for example, people may strike, an act of omission, and simultaneously picket, an act of commission. And so this definition, one thing that is clear from this definition is that nonviolent action is really about changing behavior patterns. And it goes to the core of Gene Sharp's theory of power. And his theory of power is that if people do not obey, if people do not cooperate, if people change their cooperation and obedience patterns, then systems of oppression, rulers, cannot rule. That in fact it's the people in a society who give power to the political or economic system or social system in that society, and that if people change their behavior and cooperation patterns, therefore they can change that system. One other important thing about this definition, and this is sort of a more technical point, is that according to this definition, nonviolent action is outside of the boundaries. It's outside of traditional sort of normal means of change. So for example, voting in an election in which elections are common, or filing a lawsuit in which the legal system, in which that is common in the legal system, don't technically qualify as acts of nonviolent action. They may be very important tools of social change. A lot of times they're used with acts of nonviolent action. So there's no conflict between sort of traditional means of change and nonviolent action means of change. Just to point that this definition really includes things outside of normal or traditional means. So one way to think about nonviolent conflict is that when two or more parties are engaged in a conflict, they're engaged in a contest. This contest, it's almost, when you think about contests, there are some things that are just sort of generic and similar along lots of different kinds of contests, whether it's a sports competition, a business competition between businesses, a political competition between political parties. Strategy matters, organization matters, good tactical choice matters. What's true in those kinds of contests and competitions is also true in nonviolent conflict. And generally speaking, very broadly speaking, in nonviolent conflicts, movements can take two kinds of actions. One, they can take actions to attempt to improve their own positions. They can try to build capacity by recruiting people, or by raising funds, or by creating a message that really appeals to lots of people. They can also take actions to try to weaken their opponents. So they can take actions that attempt to deny their opponents legitimacy, or attempt to switch people who support their opponents to start supporting the movement, or to deny their opponents various human or material resources. Opponents can do the same thing to movements. Opponents can try to deny movements human resources, material resources, and legitimacy. And opponents can also take actions to improve the opponent's position by collecting more taxes, by attempting to recruit more people to various government institutions so that they increase their strength, or corporate institutions. I would note that opponents aren't always governments. They can be corporations. They can be oppressive social practices. So in this contest, we don't have time to cover all four kinds of action in this webinar. So for this webinar, we're just going to focus on number two. We're going to look at actions that movements can take to try to weaken their opponents. And we call these actions that movements can take to weaken their opponents. When a movement tries to weaken their opponent, we say the movement is trying to impose a cost on their opponent. And we say this because when you look at systems of oppression, the oppressors generally have a model, a sort of cost-benefit model for what they're doing. Some would say they have a profit model for what they're doing. They understand that if they expend a certain amount of economic and material resources, for example, in order to keep the system of oppression going, that they're generally going to get more economic and material resources back from that system than they're going to have to spend to maintain that system. Similarly, politically, they understand that they may have to do things that are unpopular politically in order to maintain that system of oppression, but that ultimately those costs, the amount of political and legitimacy, political capital and legitimacy that they have to spend to maintain that system will be worth it, because it will maintain that system, and people will either believe that this oppressor is therefore legitimate, or they will be too afraid to oppose that oppressor. So what nonviolent movements do is they come and they disrupt this profit model. They disrupt the cost structure that oppressors use to rule. They attempt to raise the cost. They make it more costly for the oppressor to try to maintain the system. If they continue to drive up the cost and they make the oppressor have to spend more and more material and human resources and legitimacy to maintain itself, the system can start to become unstable. If the cost continues to rise, even people who support the movement's opponent may start to question, well, I wonder if this opponent can really survive. I wonder if this system is going to last. When I say survive, by the way, I'm not referring to life and death. I'm referring to a system of oppression. Can a system of oppression survive? And they begin sometimes to question, perhaps the movement is saying something that's worth listening to. Perhaps it makes more sense to begin to support the movement. So as the costs are driven up, people's loyalties start to become questioned, and sometimes people's loyalties start to shift. As they shift more and more, the movement gets more support, and the movement eventually gets a lot of leverage and is able to achieve its objectives. So a cost is a specific expense or penalty. Some costs can be projected or regulated. So for example, a movement may impose an economic cost, which you can count, like lost income due to a boycott or strike, or they may impose a political cost, which is tougher to measure, but sometimes can be measured with polls. It's not critical to measure every cost, of course. It's not possible. But just to point that some costs are definitely measurable, others are a little bit less so. But with every action that a movement takes, there's also risk. Anytime a movement attempts to impose a cost, there are risks. Perhaps unexpected things will occur that damage the movement. Perhaps the opponent will make a countermove that damages the movement. So you'll see my definition of risk up there. It's a potential loss that can occur because of an action, but it's not certain to occur. So we're going to talk about two different kinds of costs and risks. I've put 3 different kinds there, but we're not going to have time to go through all of them. So the first kind that I'm going to talk about is economic and material costs. How do movements impose economic and material costs on opponents? Why are they effective? And what are the risks involved in doing that? I will also talk about legitimacy and political costs. Again, what movements can do to impose those costs on their opponent, what are some of the reasons why those costs are so powerful and effective, and what are the risks involved in imposing those costs. And the third kinds of costs, because we don't have time to get to it in this presentation, perhaps we can discuss it in the question and answer session or in email correspondence afterwards. So let's talk about some examples of economic and material costs. Some of you may know about the Montgomery bus boycott. In the middle of the 20th century, segregation, discrimination was encoded into law in the United States South and other parts of the United States. And in a particular city, Montgomery, African Americans and some of their allies decided they were going to take action against this discrimination, and they focused on buses. So buses had various discriminatory practices, such as African Americans having to get up and offer seats to white passengers. Buses didn't stop in all African American neighborhoods the way they did in white neighborhoods, and various other derogatory, demeaning, unfair, unequal aspects of that system. But African Americans also comprised 70% of bus riders. They made 70% of revenue for those bus companies that were oppressing them. They realized this. They chose to take an action of boycotting those buses. They stopped riding. At the same time, they set up an alternative system of an alternative taxi and busing system for themselves that was informal, that helped people get to their jobs and back and forth. And over the course of a year, or a little bit more than a year, they were ultimately successful. The cause of their success, I would argue, was largely due to the bus boycott. There were also some legal measures they took to achieve that success, which were important. But discussing all of that is beyond the scope right now of this webinar, so I'm going to keep moving. Another example from the U.S. Civil Rights Movement was the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins and the Nashville downtown boycott. In Nashville, Tennessee, in certain dining areas, or many dining areas and restaurants, it was illegal, or black people could not get served in certain restaurants. So African Americans, black people, and some of their allies organized sit-ins where they went to various dining establishments, asked to be served. When they weren't served, they sat there until the restaurant closed and went home. Well, this happened a few times without much backlash, and then I believe the third or fourth time in which this happened, this is around 1960 in late February, they were beaten, and then they were arrested. This created a lot of media, publicity and press, and what the movement decided to do next was quite interesting. They didn't just do civil disobedience at the lunch counters. They decided they were going to do a consumer boycott of all of downtown Nashville. So African Americans and their allies stopped shopping in downtown Nashville. They're imposing an economic cost. This boycott downtown also led to white people. Many white people wanted to avoid downtown because they didn't want to see people holding signs saying don't shop. So suddenly downtown Nashville and that business establishment was hurting very badly. At that point, the business establishment said we're having economic costs imposed on us and started trying to pressure the mayor of Nashville to change the system, to give them, to make statements saying, okay, we're going to change the system because businesses were losing money. And we're going to get into more about this dynamic later, but that's just another example. Give you one more detailed example and then a few other short ones. In Port Elizabeth, South Africa, the man in the picture there, his name is Conversely Jack. And Conversely Jack was an organizer. I believe he's about 27 in that picture. And in May 1985, he decided to organize a boycott of businesses in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. He had seen the effects of violence and violent resistance on the resistance movement, and he realized that when violence was used, generally speaking, it was not effective in achieving the objectives for which it was used by the resistance. It justified a major crackdown against the resistance, and it also meant that a lot of black South Africans chose not to join the violence because they didn't want to take the risk or didn't believe that violence was the way to go. So he decided nonviolent methods might be better, and he also realized that he wanted to do a tactic that would be felt directly by the white community that was supporting apartheid. So they launched a boycott in Port Elizabeth. White businesses began to hurt. It's estimated that white store owners lost about 30% of their business. And it's very interesting what happened next. The businesses, like in Nashville, Tennessee, the businesses in Port Elizabeth started to put pressure on the government. They sent telegrams to their members of parliament. And one member of parliament said of the boycott, quote, "This was one of the most effective weapons that the blacks had ever found," and that he got more calls from constituents about this issue than any other issue before. Again, showing the power of imposing economic and material costs. Another example would be the United Farm Workers and their unionizing efforts in California. I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit later, so I'll move to the next slide. The Indian boycott of British cloth. Here you have Gandhi calling for not just Indians to stop buying British cloth, but to build their own capacity to create their own cloth. So he's doing two things. He's attempting to impose an economic cost on the British. He's also attempting to build the capacity of his movement. I'm going to keep going because time is limited. Okay. So why are these tactics powerful? Well, one reason we just heard about was that when a movement chooses to impose economic costs on its opponent, what happens is that the opponent sometimes will split. So you have a business community or a community or a group among the opponent's supporters who wants to get wealthy off of the oppression. And then you have political elites in the opponent who want to maintain that system of oppression because that's part of their political structure. So they're loyal to the existing oppression for two different reasons. One is loyal for political reasons. The other is loyal for economic reasons. When a movement, like they did in Port Elizabeth, like they did in Nashville, begins to put economic pressure on that system, suddenly the economic interests start to get into a conflict with the political interests in that system and start to put pressure on the political interests. This is a key concept, and it can take place at a lot of different levels. On a national level, you could see a split between the business community, or those who are profiting from oppression, and those who are trying to maintain this political system of oppression for their own political gain. You could see it at a city level, you could see it at a state level, you could probably even see it at the level of an individual organization. So this is one important dynamic. Another important dynamic to understand is how economic costs are targeted. So there's this idea, which I learned about from an organization called New Tactics in Human Rights, called tactical mapping. I believe it's used in a lot of different places. I found it very useful to explain this idea of economic costs. If people are interested, I can refer them to more resources about this. But say, for example, you have a corporation, okay, and you're trying, and a movement is trying to figure out how to target economic costs at that corporation. One thing that they can do is map out all the relationships that that corporation requires in order to function. So that corporation needs consumers to buy the product. It needs workers to work at the corporation to produce a product. It needs managers to manage that corporation. It needs external financing, whether banks or investors, to make loans. It needs people to transport materials in and transport materials out. It needs stores to sell the products, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, each of those relationships that that corporation depends on in order to function can also be a source of leverage. It can be something that a movement can target to try to make their voice heard and try to shift the power dynamic between itself and the corporation. So I'll give you an example. In 1965, the United Farm Workers, well, at that point it wasn't even called the United Farm Workers, it was a union that would later become the United Farm Workers. They were trying to organize people who were working in grape vineyards in Southern California. These were migrant laborers. These were people who, most of whom were homeless, and they followed work wherever they found it, depending on where grapes were being harvested or where other produce was being harvested. They were considered very poor, very low on the economic and social sort of social system in the United States, and particularly Southern California, and they wanted to form a union. So in 1965, they went on strike. And I believe they started going on strike at 9 farms. I believe they later expanded that to 48 farms. And here you have a picture of one of the UFW volunteers with the word huelga, which is Spanish for strike. They went on strike. They stopped working at the vineyards. And one of the things that the farmers started doing is they started importing strike breakers to attempt to continue that system of oppression. And the strike breakers came in and worked, though some of them refused to cross the picket line, but some of them worked. And ultimately, the United Farm Workers realized that a strike alone was not enough to shift the power dynamic between them and these farmers. So they tried another tactic. They continued the strike, but then they went to the docks. They went to the places where the grapes are shipped. And they said to the union that worked on the docks, the longshoremen, they said, you know what? We're trying to form a union. So far we haven't been successful, but we'd like you to support us because you're also a union, and you can support us by not shipping grapes on your dock that are coming in on your dock. So the longshoremen, the union that worked on this dock, chose not to ship grapes for a period of time, which imposed another cost on these farmers, on this sort of corporate entity. And what's interesting or notable is that grapes, if you don't ship them very quickly, they go bad. So even a delayed shipment of 3 to 5 days can make a really big difference. Well, that wasn't enough. So they continued, and the United Farm Workers decided that they were going to call in a consumer boycott. So now they're pressuring the system in 3 different ways. They're choosing to strike. They're trying to cut off transportation. They're also talking to consumers and telling them not to purchase grapes. This is a really interesting, brilliant case of strategic nonviolent conflict. I don't have time to go into all the sort of strategy that was used. This didn't just happen overnight. This happened over the course of 5 years, and there are a lot of great lessons about this. But ultimately, they got a consumer boycott going. They also went to food distribution centers and tried to block those. Stores that sold grapes from California, they started boycotting those stores, and ultimately, they were successful. And after 5 years, they had unionized 85% of the table grape market in California, which was 20,000 workers. This was a movement that 5 years before this had, I think, less than $100 in their bank account and very little success at organizing this far. They did an amazing job. And what helped them to succeed? Well, one of the things that you can see on this diagram is that they found multiple points of pressure. And when they used these multiple points of pressure simultaneously, when they pressured from the consumer angle, from the angle of stores, from workers, from transportation, they were able to achieve power and meet their objectives. So one thing to look at when you think about imposing economic costs or look at a movement imposing economic costs is to think about how many directions are they able to exert their leverage from? How many ways can they exert strength on their target? That can sometimes have a big role. Now, there are also risks in imposing economic and material costs. There are risks of engaging in strikes. There are risks of choosing not to pay rent or taxes or bills. So there's a statement, a movement must be able to survive its own offense. So it's not uncommon when movements decide they're going to strike without a lot of strategic planning ahead of time to realize that their opponent can wait a lot longer than they can. So when they impose that economic cost on their opponent by striking, they realize they're also imposing a cost on themselves. They're denying themselves money. And if workers don't have enough support for their families when they go on strike, sometimes all the opponent has to do is wait. I remember I was speaking to a friend of mine in Nepal who said this recently happened there, that basically a strike was called. Ultimately, people weren't able to remain on strike for long enough, and ultimately they had to go back to work. The strike failed. So strike funds, establishing funds or organizations by a movement to support strikers can be really critically important. Another sort of risk of imposing economic costs is that sometimes movements need to create parallel institutions, and sometimes they fail to do so. For example, the Montgomery bus boycott that I talked about earlier probably would have failed soon, quickly, if they hadn't set up a parallel institution, a parallel busing system in order to have people's needs met. And another risk of imposing economic costs is that economic costs can sometimes be passed on. So, for example, in 2006 in Mexico, when there were disputed presidential elections, there were rallies by the declared loser, Emmanuel López Obrador. His supporters decided to do rallies and various acts of nonviolent action to support him. So one of the rallies that they did was on July 31st, 2006, and they set up encampments all along one of Mexico City's main streets, main arteries, and they held up traffic for weeks. And I got this little piece of information from Wikipedia. There was a poll taken by the newspaper El Universal, and they found that though 59% of Mexico City residents believed that there was fraud in the presidential election, the encampments that blocked up traffic were widely unpopular, and 65% opposed them, according to a poll taken August 9, 2006. So here you had a movement attempting to impose an economic cost, and that cost was actually passed on to the movement's supporters, potential supporters, and those supporters ultimately turned against the movement. They found that this was an unpopular, unsuccessful tactic. So I have 10 minutes left, 8 minutes left, to talk about political and legitimacy costs, but this section should be a little shorter than the previous one, so I'm going to just keep plowing through. Let's do some examples. So the Otpor movement in Serbia in 2000, one of my favorite and very simple tactics that they did, this is what we call a backfire tactic. They found a way to make the opponent's repression backfire against the opponent. They found a way to make the repression lower the opponent's legitimacy significantly. So the dictator at that time, Slobodan Milosevic, his son actually, according to the account that I read, was involved in beating this man. The picture, you see his picture right in front of you on my PowerPoint. You can see he has bruises, cuts. And what Otpor did after this beating was discovered was they made a poster that said, "This is the face of Serbia," and they put this up around cities. This face of this beaten man, beaten by the dictator's own son, this is the face of Serbia. A really powerful message to attempt to lower the legitimacy of their opponent. The Salt March, I'm sure many of you on this webinar are familiar with this account. For those of you who aren't, very briefly, the British, when they were the colonial rulers of India, taxed salt. It was one of the most obnoxious, invasive overreaches of the British Empire in terms of intruding on people's everyday lives and being very, very difficult to defend in any kind of way. It's sort of a blatant power grab to try to get more revenues and impose ridiculous restrictions on Indians. Gandhi, on March 12, 1930, wrote a letter to the British Viceroy, said he's going to defy the salt law. He marched for 26 days, over 200 miles, got to the ocean, made salt, and the regime then was in the regime was in a horrible position at that point because they had to decide, do we arrest Gandhi, which will create a big backlash against us, even internationally beyond just within India, or do we let him get away with this, in which case we lose legitimacy because it then appears that we can't enforce our own laws. Gandhi knew this going into it. He designed a brilliant dilemma action. We'll talk about dilemma actions a little bit more. There was a lot more to the salt boycott, the salt march that came afterwards. For example, there were boycotts of British cloth. Students withdrew from schools. They boycotted liquor stores. There were acts of civil disobedience. So there's a lot more to it than that. But the salt march itself was an amazing example of imposing a political legitimacy cost. Another brief example would be the Solidarity movement in Poland. They were quoting, back in the early 1980s, they would quote the Polish Constitution, saying that they had the right to organize their labor union. And after all, the communist government claimed it was, created a workers' state. So it lowered their legitimacy significantly when Polish workers themselves said, we'd actually like to organize an independent union from the government. And Solidarity, as many of us know, over the course of a 9-year struggle, was successful in regaining the country of Poland. One additional example, I think this is a very clever tactic. In the Republic of Georgia in 2003, the organization Camara, or the movement Camara, started a campaign to pressure the Georgian health ministry. Now, what was the issue there? There was a girl who had a heart problem, and the government health ministry was refusing to pay for an operation, and if she didn't get an operation, she was going to die. So, excuse me one second. Needed to get some water. So this girl was told she was going to die. And what Camara started to do is they started a collection campaign to raise funds for her operation, and they started demonstrating outside of the health ministry. This made the government look horrible. Here you have a social movement that's supporting this woman, or this girl, trying to help her in a way that the government isn't, and ultimately the government had to give in, provide money for her heart operation, and she got it. The movement was really good at imposing a legitimacy cost on the government. I'm going to continue on through these. I don't have time right now to go through these other several cases, but let's talk a little bit about why these actions are successful. So one thing to think about when looking at movements that are imposing legitimacy and political costs is this concept of dilemma actions. And a dilemma action, the creation of it involves 3 steps. The first is to find legal restrictions, government rules, regulations, even just social norms that are obnoxious, that affect people's day-to-day or personal lives. Really invasive overreaches of state power. So for example, saying we're going to tax salt, which you can make in the ocean for free, but we're going to tax it. When the British did that to the Indians, that's an example of an extremely ridiculous, obnoxious law that is going to meet opposition. Another example, for example, would be during the United Farm Workers struggle that I alluded to earlier. At one point, a sheriff in Southern California said it's illegal to say the word huelga, which is Spanish for strike. It's illegal. You can't say it. So the movement realized that was a really ridiculous law. It wasn't even a law. It was a decree. They organized resistance against it. They openly defied it. And the law severely backfired against the sheriff and gained the movement actually a lot of support. So finding these restrictions is the first step in creating dilemma action. Then movements can design tactics to challenge these restrictions. Some tactics employ humor. Some tactics employ, famous individuals to make a statement. Some tactics use religious or cultural or patriotic language or symbols. Otpor, for example, the Serbian movement against Milosevic, used a lot of nationalistic imagery, and one of their slogans was "Resistance because I love Serbia." So they were claiming sort of the patriotic high ground in this struggle, and when they did something like saying, "This is the face of Serbia," it was sort of invoking the sense of Serbian patriotism and Serbian nationalism to say, we can't have this. And the third, and really not to be overlooked, element of successful dilemma actions is strategizing to gain as much as possible after the tactic has taken place, regardless of the outcome. So dilemma actions are called dilemma actions because the opponent, the movement's opponent, has no good choices after they're done. They have no, if they try to repress the movement, they'll look bad. If they allow the movement to get away with the action, they tend to look weak. So effective dilemma actions often involve a movement planning ahead of time for all kinds of contingencies. If the opponent does this, we're going to do that. If the opponent does something else, we're going to do this. They usually have a media plan for what to do. If media is allowed in the country, they usually have some way of escalating the conflict afterwards, or they have a plan to try to make the repression backfire against the opponent. So I have 0 minutes left, so I'm going to just go very quickly to risks of imposing political and legitimacy costs. And I'm going to just give 2 examples. I'm going to show 2 images. One is a G20 demonstration in Melbourne, Australia, and the other is a demonstration against the Iraq War. And so here's the Iraq War demonstration right here. And I'll read for you what some of the signs that people are saying say. One says, full rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, immigrants, women, and all, stop the war in Iraq. Another one looks like it's supporting socialism, the Socialist Party. Another one appears to be an anti-global warming sign. Let's take a look at another demonstration, which sort of provides a more stark example of what I'm about to talk about. Here you have this G20 protest in Melbourne, Australia, and you have one person holding a sign that says no nuclear reactor. So they're against some nuclear reactor. I don't know if it's local or national issue. And then you have another person talking about canceling debt as a way to prevent death of who, I don't know. So what am I getting at here? What I'm getting at is one of the risks when movements attempt to impose costs, economic and political legitimacy costs, is that the message can be really unclear. In incidents where movements don't make clear exactly what they're for and what they're against, people can take actions for all kinds of reasons that they personally support but that are outside of the movement's objectives. And this can create a lot of confusion, and it can sometimes create a movement that is very limited in its appeal. For example, I may be a person who is for nuclear power but supports canceling debt. But if I see both those signs at the Australian rally, I may not support that movement. On the other hand, I may be against nuclear power but think that debt shouldn't be canceled. In that case, I'm still not going to support that movement. So the more sort of issues start to get brought to the table and show up at every time the movement attempts to impose a legitimacy cost on its opponent, sometimes the more confused people get who are outside of the movement, and sometimes the less likely they are to support it. An additional risk is that tactics can get hijacked by other groups. So for example, demonstrations or even symbolic actions, again, this is sort of similar to the last point, is that even if a movement does try to maintain a strict, clear message, other groups can still sometimes come in from the outside and try to steal the spotlight. And one way that they do that, for example, is creating more disruption, create incidents of violence. So a movement that may attempt to be nonviolent, be very clear about that. Windows could be broken, property could be destroyed, rocks could be thrown, and suddenly the movement's message is forgotten in terms of, and the effectiveness of that action goes down significantly. So those are some risks, well-known risks, well-documented risks, but there they are. And I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Hardy, thank you so much for a great presentation. And we're going to keep sharing your screen. That way, if people have questions about some of your points, you can go back in your PowerPoint if you so choose. So at this point, I want to remind everybody that if they have a question for Hardy, they can click that raise hand button on their control panel. That's on the top left-hand side of your webinar control panel. It's a little hand. You just click it, and it shows me that you have something you want to ask or say, and I'll call on you in turn and unmute you, and you can speak directly to Hardy. Or you can type in a question in the question box, and there should be a little bar in your control panel that says questions. And if you open that up, you can type it in just like a chat window, and I'll read it on your behalf. So I see a couple hands going up, and our first one will come from Jonathan Rudy. So I've unmuted you. Go ahead, introduce yourself, and go ahead with your question for Hardy.
Hardy, thank you very much for presenting this. And yeah, I'm John Rudy of Peace Building Global. I'm a nonviolent social change strategist, and I've faced this dilemma quite often in even the name nonviolence. It's something that's I wish we had a more positive term. So my question is this analysis of costs and risks only in the negative? The inverse of costs is benefits, and this is a much more positive way to cast, especially the economic factors here. It may have the effect of drawing allies instead of carving out a negative space. When we highlight the potential gains of nonviolent change, nonviolent action. So I'd appreciate a comment on that, Hardy.
Thank you so much for your question. I can only affirm that you've made a really good point, and you could certainly frame a different presentation along the lines of benefits of various forms of nonviolent action, as well as unintended positive consequences of various forms of nonviolent action. And I'll, since I have a moment, I'll provide an example. So if we look at the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, what did the movement do? Well, they imposed economic costs. Ultimately, they were successful in integrating the busing system in that southern city. But the benefit of that was much more than just integrating buses. The benefit, of course, was it gave the movement a clear victory, which showed that progress was possible with nonviolent action. It gave people hope. It, I think, also shifted a lot of people who had been passive and sort of supported the system of segregation in the South to really question that system. These were all unintended, or perhaps intended, but sort of indirect benefits of doing this one action, which was targeted at imposing economic costs. So great point.
Great, thanks, Jonathan, for your question. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and go ahead with your question.
I found the presentation by Hardy actually very interesting. It's interesting as usual, actually. But I'm specifically interested in the strategies and tactics, which Hardy actually underscored by saying that the strategies and tactics chosen by the movement matters. It really matters, but we should also at the same time look at the responses that the regime or the adversary uses to kind of meet these strategies and tactics. And this brings me to the point Hardy raised in talking about risks, which is about tactics being hijacked by the other groups. And this happens a lot of times. And the point being that the strategies and tactics that should be chosen depend also on the nature of the regime against which the movement is launched. And there are experiences, like in my own country, whereby the opposition or like a movement tried to use peaceful methods, but they say, at least they claim that the process, their movement, their message has been hijacked, and some violent actions resulted because of the actions taken by the government by way of orchestrating some violent kind of action. much as you raise the risk when you're talking about the tactic being hijacked, I didn't also see a suggestion or a kind of advice that you would give to leaders of a movement whose tactics have been hijacked. And that's actually the question that I wanted to ask.
Thank you so much for your question. And the reason I didn't say anything was partly just because of a limitation of time. You made a lot of great points, and I'll try to respond to a few of them very quickly. And we can continue this conversation further over email if you want. One thing I didn't say, it was sort of the most obvious risk of any kind of tactic, is the risk of repression, for sure. And a classic sort of way to think about tactics, one very simple way to think about it, is low risk and high risk. Generally speaking, high risk tactics tend to be centralized. They tend to bring a lot of people together in one place. Protests are a classic example, protest demonstrations. And those tactics are generally the easiest to repress. Everyone is out in the open, everyone's in a concentrated place. So a movement that's really concerned about repression and may choose to not do centralized tactics. Or if they do centralized tactics, they've got a very clear plan for how to make the repression backfire. They may choose decentralized tactics. So if you look, for example, at what they did in Port Elizabeth, a boycott is incredibly decentralized. It was designed to reduce the amount of risk for each person. Reducing this risk meant that more people could participate in the boycott because they weren't so afraid. But it didn't reducing the risk didn't reduce the impact. The boycott was so successful that the South African government declared a state of emergency after just 5 days. That's how scared they were of this tactic. Even after they declared the state of emergency, however, they still didn't know who to arrest. How can you tell, for example, who's choosing not to shop on a certain day? You can't. You can't tell by looking at them. And so this is just one way to think about, risk as an incredibly important element of any kind of tactical choice. Now, you also talk about hijacking, and a couple points about that. Some tactics are easier to hijack than other tactics. Again, marches and demonstrations can be more easily hijacked than, say, decentralized tactics like, again, for example, perhaps a boycott. So tactical choice can have some effect in terms of limiting the ability of groups to hijack. The other thing that movements do, of course, is that they very aggressively try to tell the public what they stand for and what they're against. So well before they do any action, they make it very clear that we are nonviolent, everyone in this movement is nonviolent, everyone in this movement has agreed to be nonviolent, and any act of violence, therefore, is not part of this movement. They say this again and again and again and again until it's in the public mind. Another thing they do is they say if there is an act of violence, it could just as well be our oppressor trying to create an act of violence. In fact, people who are violent may in fact be working for the oppressor. Therefore, we distance ourselves from them completely. There are also tactical, very small things. For example, if there is a demonstration and people get violent, to circle those people with a crowd of nonviolent people so that they're isolated. So those are all just sort of small things. We don't have a lot of time to deal with the issue of hijacking. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question that has been texted in from Daria Dalal, which says, how do you imagine nonviolence functions in reducing the individual costs in the collective action problem?
Okay. Thanks for your question. I'll choose an example that I'll choose the United Farm Workers as an example. You'll remember from that screen that I showed earlier how they targeted all these different relationships of their opponent, these farmers, which basically were a corporation or a set of corporations. And when they did that, they had some actions that people could do that would take no more than 5 or 10 minutes of time and had very little risk or anything. Don't buy grapes, send in a postcard, of support for this boycott to, your member of Congress, or do some small basic actions. They had some mid-range actions that required more commitment, more sacrifice from people. So, for example, volunteering for a certain amount of time, picketing in front of a store that was selling grapes, recruiting people, et cetera, and then they have the highest risk level, which was, people who were striking right there facing police in California, who were sometimes beaten. Now, this whole struggle happened in the context of a democracy, although I would say that the democracy didn't really feel like any sort of democracy for those who were fighting the struggle. I mean, the United Farm Workers were oppressed. The democracy wasn't working for everyone. It certainly wasn't working for them. And I understand that there are systems in which there is no democracy anywhere in a country. But I think the same principle applies, that movements try to find different levels of involvement and different levels of risk by creating a variety of tactics that can appeal to someone who might only have 10 minutes in their day and has to provide for their family or children, but can still do a small action in order to support the movement. Another example, like that, for example, would be, Otpor was brilliant at using stickers and even sometimes graffiti, something that someone could do in a minute or two, just putting them up everywhere, which gave the sense that the regime was losing control because there was Otpor slogans and signs everywhere. Now, small risk had an impact, and not just a political legitimacy impact. It didn't just show that the regime can't maintain control. If the regime wanted to remove this sticker, remove this graffiti, it might cost the regime, it would cost the regime money. They had to pay someone to do it. But the cost to produce this tiny little sticker or graffiti might have been just pennies or, very small amount for the movement. The cost to deal with it was much higher for the regime, so it actually was an economic cost too. Thanks.
Mara Shoney, who is at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. She writes, regarding strategic and tactical analysis of organizing and action potential, are there features that distinguish nonviolent strategizing from other types of organizing?
The answer, I suppose, is yes and no. Let's talk about what, I'm going to guess what you mean by other types of organizing. So other types of organizing, I'm guessing you mean as sort of more conventional political party organizing or typical election year organizing or organizing to support a certain issue. And that kind of organizing, do you need to craft a compelling message in order to get people to your cause? Absolutely. Do you need to have a clear understanding of what your volunteers are doing and make sure that your resources are targeted to produce the maximum effect? Absolutely. Do you need to, do an analysis of where the public is and who your opponent is and what their strengths and weaknesses are and what the public cares about and try to appeal to the public? Absolutely. All of those components and many others have a lot in common with organizing in nonviolent conflict, a great deal. I guess the notable difference is that nonviolent conflict, you have this enormous tactical variety that you can choose from that in maybe more traditional forms of organizing is much more limited. So, for example, in 1973, Gene Sharp documented 198 different kinds of nonviolent action in his book, The Politics of Nonviolent Action. And every year we can add more and more examples and tactics to that list. People are incredibly creative about finding ways to disobey or to create new patterns of behavior. And so in that regard, you've got this great sort of creative potential in nonviolent conflict that is also for sure present in traditional community organizing, but the ways of expressing this in nonviolent action are remarkably broad. And perhaps your tactical set is a little broader when choosing nonviolent action than traditional community organizing.
Great, thanks, Hardy. This will be our last question, and Diana did kind of clarify her question, so we'll do that one, and then we'll give you some time to have some concluding comments. So just to repeat, Diana's question was, does the splintering of media outlets make it more difficult to create issue awareness through nonviolent action? And she clarifies that by saying, if people are only reading the media that matches their point of view, how do you reach them with a nonviolent movement that is asking them to see things differently?
Thank you for a great question. And And I agree with you. It seems like there might be a little bit of a concern in your question of people reading only media that affirms their view, and that is a real issue, I think, in many places. The challenge that movements have is one of the challenges they have is to frame their issue and get it out there to a variety of different interests. Okay, and so let's go back to the Port Elizabeth boycott. I once had a conversation with the organizer of that boycott, Conversely Jack, and if I remember correctly, he said, I was able to frame the South African anti-apartheid struggle from a whole variety of perspectives, everything from a pro-democracy struggle, human rights struggle, anti-discrimination struggle, labor struggle. He didn't say this, but I'm sure there was a way to frame it as a women's rights struggle as well, as an anti-corruption struggle. And so the ability to develop whole different sets of discourse for how to describe what a movement's doing is incredibly important. But there are also tactical choices that can help do this. So let's focus on the United Farm Workers now. You heard me earlier refer to that incident where the word huelga, strike, was outlawed. So let's talk about what they did. They were pretty brilliant strategically. And so many of the participants in the United Farm Workers were Mexican and Filipino, and many of them were Catholic. So they got a priest who supported them to go with them out publicly into a field and start yelling the word huelga. While the media was there, they made a statement about their movement, started yelling the word huelga, were arrested, media cameras are rolling. Suddenly, they've been able to frame this issue not just as a bunch of migrant laborers who want to labor unionize. Suddenly, Catholics start hearing about this issue because the photo is of a reverend getting arrested, and the story involves a minister that's getting arrested. That same day that they were arrested, Cesar Chavez, one of the leaders of that movement, made a speech at the University of California in Berkeley and said, just today, people in my movement have been arrested for exercising their free speech. Well, at that time, in the mid-1960s, free speech was a very big issue amongst students. So suddenly students became really interested because this related to their interests as well. This was also a free speech issue. So this kind of ability to frame and reframe, both through rhetoric and words, but also through tactics and images, can be really important for movements to sort of get across that splintering of media market share and their audience. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Hardy. I want to give you a chance to have some concluding comments about your presentation. I know there are a couple of you who texted in some questions, and we didn't get time to get to all of them, but rest assured we're going to send all those questions to our presenter, and that way he can, if he has time, respond to those directly. So, Hardy, any concluding remarks?
I would like to conclude by thanking everyone who joined this webinar. This has been a new experience for me. I've never done this before. It feels a little bit like acting in front of a blue screen, where you don't have the advantage of being able to see everyone that you're with, and yet I am so grateful that all of you came, and I really look forward to answering any questions that people have further. Thank you again.
Cool. And so a couple last announcements. Hardy, thank you again to you for taking the time, putting together a great presentation. This whole webinar has been recorded, so we're going to make a video and audio version of it available on our website, and we'll inform you when that becomes available. We also will be sharing his PowerPoint presentation and then other additional resources that are related to this topic. And like I said, we'll be sending your questions that didn't get answered along to Hardy. So please stay in touch with ICNC. We have a whole series of webinars coming up during the fall season, and we'll keep you up to date about when those are scheduled and how you can register. With that, have a great rest of the day, evening, morning, wherever you may be around the world. Thanks.